Hi, hey, how are you? Happy full moon in Virgo. Um, as the world moves into an energetic new year. Um, with Aries season and all of the action that it has in it. There's a moon in Virgo. It's the full moon is the closest that it is to the earth. It's going to be big. It's going to be juicy. It's going to be right there, hanging from ripe. The Sun and Mercury is in Pisces. And hear me out. I feel like, obvious heat and water, but I feel like that's very much creating the heating conditions for a launch of energy through Venus and Chiron and Jupiter and Aries with Eris. It feels kind of like a surprise, and also perhaps given the last legs of Saturn in Aquarius, and barely, it's sort of teetering on the fence and moving directly into Pisces. But I feel like that, because of that, we're feeling the intensity, like last deacon, of the cutting off of dead limbs. And maybe that's also the intensity of impulse as well. And again, with ample heating conditions for all of this Aries nature. But I feel like that sort of shedding is a very intense feeling, and gives me not just a surprise, but a painful truth in the combination of where all of these things are together. Which brings me back to the moon being in Virgo. And very poignantly so. And Virgo is a very definitive energy, but can be a very demanding energy as well. But that's hand in hand with its definitive nature. And I think while all of those heating conditions will lean themselves perhaps more toward that definitive and that demanding, let's not forget the soft side of Virgo is also very not just organizing, but like attentive. And in that, there can also be some compassion. Sometimes it's not necessarily cutting off, but moving from apathy to enthusiastic consent, or to love in other contexts. I think that will set the stage for when the moon not transcends, but moves into Libra, because I also have some thought leaning to, well, if that's the midheaven of where our north and south nodes are, then as intense as this can be, as demanding, as definitive, as heated, as impulsive, keep in mind the momentum can also lead us to leaning toward that compassionate, equalizing, and a Libra nature. It's sort of like it's setting the stage for that. It's preparing for that idea. And I think if we do not lend our ear to that idea and forget that nature, it'll lead to a more impulsive and difficult adjustment period. That being said, we're going to pick some cards, and shit's getting real, so I'm going to use Old Faithful. And we'll see. That does just stick, doesn't it? That was just kind of too perfect. Gosh, okay. friends. Okay. Full moon, dear. What have you for us, my friends? Oh yeah, much like we've done in any other time before, but if we haven't and you haven't, try it out. Just like there's cards in between us, find a comfortable spot to sit where you feel like you're open, available to information. Ideally, straight spine, but you just don't want to be focusing on your body. You don't want your body to be distracting, you know? Yeah. Anyway, deep breaths, 3 deep breaths. 3 deep breaths. Deep breath in. And exhale. Deep breath in. And exhale. Deep breath in. And exhale. Okay, there's a challenge of will, which I noticed because my thumb twitched in an interesting way. A challenge of will, and where we find pushback can also can serve as motivation in sort of a trampoline effect, you know, like in a sort of rubber band effect, which would lead again to my surprise and hard truth element, because that happens very fast. Not ricochet, but you know what I mean. I do get the sense that emotional sides are very overworked, and perhaps that's the will thing, and sort of the hard truth. I feel like when you exhaust that aspect, things can become very impulsive and reactionary, and people have been very heated. The 8 of Wands was the first thing pulled, and that's like supercharged. It's like sticking your finger in a fucking socket, which isn't all it is. Dangerous, don't do that. But I've used that metaphor in the past, and it was about recharging, and rather than shutting yourself off to intensity of experience or emotion or what have you, you can find the energy that you feel is lost in the things that surround you. This came from an idea in Reiki where you use your energy to heal, but sometimes when we need healing, because of that, you are still a conduit, and it was phrased to me as if you're like tapping into the natural energy of everything around you, and sort of using that as a natural resources, like solar panels, I suppose, and being able to recharge in that way. And so I feel like that is where that is going. It's inverted. So it's not necessarily about the explosiveness, and it's not necessarily about creating with it, but it is going to be about understanding it, maybe understanding where it comes from. I feel like it's a very triggering card, and I feel like it can be a lot to sit with, and it like makes me antsy to even think about that. However, it is about understanding where the current is coming from, and it's about understanding that level of intensity. Because if you don't understand that level of intensity in a very like raw and real way, you could blow your capacitor. Point blank, period. The Fool is the following card, which I think in the face of new journeys and in the face of new identities, in the face of new patterns, that can be just very intimidating. And there's a lot of unknowns and what ifs are deafening questions. I've heard that before. What ifs can also be very distracting and very destructive in that distraction, and become a loop of miseries and preference in that. Perhaps that's what all of the challenges, this is also inverted, perhaps that's what all of these challenges is, that pressure kind of pushing back. But when there is a will challenged, there can be a will, it's the opportunity for your will to prevail over doubt and over all of these things. So again, push back, but maybe that's where the surprise comes in, is you surprise your fucking self. More often than not, that's what anything is. I mean, and even, like, if the Fool is afraid of failure, then the Fool is foolishly not understanding the lessons in that, and where that there's so much power that lies in those experiences too. Experience over education, which leads me to the Five of Wands. Experience over education, because education can also kind of condition you to only see things in a specifically structured way, and can also point doubt at questions, and or like point shame at questions, and like, if you're not doing it within this structured way, then that is wrong. You're going outside of your bounds, when perhaps it's just creative problem solving, perhaps it's just a new creative understanding, or how this person has to digest this information, because we all function a little bit differently, or process a little bit differently, or understand things a little bit differently. That is something that I constantly am toying with and learning. I feel like understanding that is where we find freedom from those structures, and the Fool is the Fool can be the one that is curiously asking and seeking. That is ultimately its superpower, and in provoking that fear and facing it, the bottom of the deck is a Star, which is ultimately, especially when I was talking about the lessons that failures can have, is ultimately where that power is found as well. Because there's abundance surrounding them, there's glistening, there's reflections, there's new doorways in those reflections, there's new geometries of light and possibilities in those reflections, and these are reflections that this character holds, and this character also exists weightlessly in. So the irony of, or the dichotomy of being grounded but also transcendent, in the way that they exist in their mind. Which is funny, actually, because I thought that to myself, actually, about myself in many instances today. Interesting. Sorry, distracting. Let's see. Okay, the card that fell out. I also want to touch on these pinks, because there's a lot of reds here, and that's speaking to the will. The will also comes from these Eight of Wands. It's a very raw nature, and it's a very, it's giving me, like believe in the sensation that you feel vibes. Like, it's the rawness and the bareness of your touch and perception specifically. The Five of Wands is dulling that sense, is dumbing that down. It's very faded, and it's very much, I feel like, as much as this character may want to transcend, the other characters are like sowing doubt, sowing a faded sense of that will, in trying to hold it down. And the Fool does not have that. It laces in, it weaves him. It is literally a main part of his garments, and it's a main part of the star's atmosphere. But also, that brings me to the card that fell out to begin with, was the Death card. Can be very wild, can be very real, can be very surprising. But it also delineates to a very grounded number. And that's perhaps where we find the ethereal in real life, where we find the spiritual in real life, and where those two worlds mix. That is the transitional path out of and into this world. And I want to touch on these reds again because I was also kind of meditating on this card when I was painting recently. And I think the Hangman's something that's come up a lot too. But I've seen it recently with this sunset in my silly mind. And I think that was very much a meditation on death for me specifically, but also the meditation on death of the many things that are changing around us and many things that are fluctuating and very aggressively in the way that I imagine red bounces in a molecular form kind of energy. And I think that is because it's a different surrounding in the Hangman card, if I'm correct, but I think generally has a more peaceful surrounding, and I think it'll be the challenge here is mixing the two and finding that level of introspection, interoception, and serenity in perspective amidst an incredible amount of chaos. And that also kind of pulls me back to this, are we, sort of tragically mourning, cutting off dead weight or dead, limbs or dead ideas of ourselves? Or are we loving and accepting of those things and sort of laying them to rest? I read recently, too, that we mourn people, like, for ourselves. And that makes it sound really selfish. But it's because we miss their presence, not here, failing to understand, not failing, missing the bigger picture that in death, that energy exists everywhere, constantly, timelessly. And perhaps maybe that's something that we fight with as a race, as a human race, is, this immortality of the soul and the impermanence of the body, and how those things can be mourned in many ways, and not just the like Lex Luthor villain way. Death walks in the same world that all of these ethereal cards do. The Fool walks into this world, essentially. The Star finds self in this world. The Eight of Wands finds a voice to their experience in this world. And I think that the significance of the cloak in this context is perhaps the Fool has met death. Perhaps the Fool has a piece of death to walk with as like a talisman or amulet or what have you. Perhaps death is not a scary figure, but is something that we learn through and we're able to walk with into new darknesses and new opportunities and new what ifs, I suppose. I just feel like this character is much more of a helpful friend on this path than it is a foreboding sort of detriment. How that is for each individual, I do not know for everybody, not just off of these cards at least, but we'll all find that sort of comfort in the path in our own ways. And I think the star is proof of that, or proof of that being something to look forward to, and something that exists throughout, because it is already present in the mood of things, and I think is already present in what exists outside of the boundaries of the Five of Wands and what exists at the heart of the Eight of Wands. Wherever that may exist for you, in the heart of your creation and in the heart of your doubt. All right, we pull numbers and we see. I also want to say, going back. Any thoughts of going back? I think with the Five of Wands, that's maybe the most solid memory, and that's perhaps the problem and part of the boundaries, where death in the Fool is in the past, and where the Fool needs to go, and where death will meet him in a kinder way. But where the Fool needs to go is not in the past, and not into the previous sunset, into the starry night ahead, and into the radiant new day and beyond. Okay. It's literal stuff. Space and time, my friend. Alrighty. 3 deep breaths. Party on with me. Take a deep breath in. And exhale. Take a deep breath in. And exhale. Take a deep breath in. And exhale. Interesting. Wait, let's see. I feel like this was very similar to another time. Okay. 7 of Swords, King of Swords, 4 of Clubs, 4 of Swords. You know, as much as I want to say, okay, this all exists in the mind also creates in the body. So this Four of Swords, it's like, okay, what kind of game is this? What kind of back and forth is this that we're playing? And I got Two of Diamonds and the Six of Hearts, which is a game of the heart and a game of the body, like a game of memory and a game of new beginnings. Like, where do you want to jump to? Where do you want to go to? And both of those places, both of these places feel like they exist more in the mind, but not necessarily as an escape. And maybe that's the big difference, is sometimes we can find ourselves in a form of escapism that is not conducive to longevity, which is the Seven of Swords. It is not the party ant. It is the sadness and the loneliness behind that. It is not the like, oh, that's just my angry grandmother. It's like, no, she's miserable. And doesn't feel like she can tell anybody or whatever. Has been holding on to this dark secret, something like that. And in a lot of ways, those are spirits that need to be put to rest by facing truth and by that sort of energetic fruition. That is, I think, the clearing of the path that the King of Swords is ultimately demanding, because that's a reset. That's an ultimate reset in the energy, is being able to kind of banish those things. And I feel like that's the power that's needed, which is bridging the Fool and death. It's almost like a noble manner, a noble experience is what fuels this sort of new place of refuge that becomes more solidified in the imagination and more solidified in routine because of that. Because if you can dream it, you can do it, but it exists in the mind before it exists in the body. Essentially. And this game between this Four of Swords and this Two and this Six, too many threads, too many modes of communication. I don't want to say too many players, but neither's also really focusing on each other. Again, it's kind of like this place in the head where the outside doesn't exist. And maybe that's a disconnect in the way that we are fantasizing, in the way that we are actualizing, or in the way that we are presenting, in the way that we are seeing, in the way that we are understanding ourselves, in the way that we are continuing to walk in the world. Are we distracted? There's friction, there's static. Are we distracted? Are we distracted from what these places can be, or are we in conflict, wanting different things in the moment and for pleasure and for a sense of self, warmth, creativity, or sense of, it's still a sense of pleasure, but it's a more I feel like I keep saying longevity, but it's a more reciprocating kind of pleasure, a more mirrored format, perhaps. Let's see what the circus has to say. What's that? We can breathe still. What is this, man? Deep breath in, deep breath out. Deep breath in, deep breath out. Deep breath in, deep breath out. Just from then to now, I would also like to say, rather than any reaching in the face of this, all of this heat and all of this or impulsive nature, everything going on in Aries, reaching only adds to the overclocking, reaching with the right hand adds to the overclocking of the left hand. We have to consider how much we can hold and how much we can juggle. I feel like there's nothing to reach for. It's all already very palpable. And it wasn't until now that this hand really felt the weight of it. The star again. Okay. In between these conversations, in between this 2 and this 6 with this 4, the star again. Eight-pronged star in the middle of these things. You know, it very much takes both of these energies and sort of weaves it up the middle. It very much takes both of these experiences. Like, you can have great pleasure and great stability. Like, you can have spontaneity and comfort and vulnerability and all of these things all mixed into one. How do we make space for those things, and how rapidly with which do we exist in those things and pour those things out? And maybe that's because we spend so much of our energy outside of ourselves and invested in other things that we have to be more conscious, bringing it all, calling it back to the middle. This is very much existing as like true north, as your central plane, and taking both of those experiences and both of those conversations and weaving them into one idea. The braid in this is really interesting, and you know, I've noticed that the more I've had long hair is sometimes, not sometimes, all the time, whenever I braid my hair, I sort of put away judgment and I try to just feel it out. And sometimes I feel like when the strands are not super even, it also says a bit about how I might be feeling in specific. And you know what? When I've had a perfect break and it's, like nice and even and evenly distributed, or like honestly when that center strand is just like a little bit chunkier, it feels very balanced. It feels very perfect. It feels like, my hair and I were in a symbiotic relationship and sort of, listening to each other, and that it expressed how balanced I felt in that moment. And there's jokes, obviously that like, a native man's single because his hair's not braided. And I feel like that exists in the way that we play with our energies as well, or the way that we spend our energies and the way that we maintenance our energies as well. And this star is very much like the one previously was very like as above, so below, top to bottom kind of stuff. This one's very like so within, so without, like existing on the mountain plane, like existing in the flow, existing in this lateral, the way that things move throughout and the way that they exist. It's a really beautiful, interesting connection, and I feel like there's a buoyancy that can exist here that is very powerful. And that, again, brings me back to this weird, like, ricochet energy that I got in the beginning. And where that can be, like, those fucking carnival fucking rides where they, like, strap you to this thing and they, like, bungee you into the air. Can be fucking terrifying. Can be exhilarating. When you're prepared for it and when you don't hold your breath. And that is a very obvious and literal metaphor, but I think is a really accurate in the way that we can maintain our composure in the face of surprises or hard truths, and maintain an equalizing nature to lend ourselves to the best parts of Virgo and the best parts of Libra as this moon grows, and the best parts of Aries as the seasons change and as we move into a new energetic new year. Ace of Pentacles, King of Swords, Ten of Swords. Also, I pulled. It's a beautiful deck. I just kind of get lost in it. The King of Swords is this King of Swords again. He's a calm character. He's a wise character. He's listening to the messages and the transitions in between. He doesn't exist for anything to prove. And that's also the magic that the star has. She exists in the elements. She doesn't exist to prove to you that there is a true north. She exists already and hopes that you find it. And the King of Swords is here to lend his calmness and his knowledge in the face of chaos. Because it's not about wielding swords. It's about all the things that you've seen. Like, he's not the King of Swords is never the, like, hot-headed fighter that the Knight of Swords can be, or that the King of Wands can be even. He's very much more about the wisdom and the storytelling and the experience. Again, experience over education. The heart of a fighter. And the Ace of Pentacles is this nugget of magic, but also very literally the way that this pentacle balances out and how it can prosper and grow. It's really the gift of what will come from all of this, the gift that will come with this star's understanding, in the face of all of this Ten of Swords inside and in the world, and inside because of the world, really. Oh, and she's so sad. Lacking motivation. She's lacking motivation. And perhaps this is what the Two of Wands is trying to wash off, and what the Six of Hearts feels most forlorn for, all the things that they could have done. And that in and of itself can be an overwhelming thought, but you just have to be forgiving with yourself in those things. And that isn't necessarily motivation, but it supports you in space. And it will perhaps rock you when you need it, so that you can find your motivation in yourself and in the star again. The Ten of Swords never lasts forever. It's just the hard parts of some shit. But we have the Ace of Pentacles. We've got magic in our pockets. And that is the token that leads this fool to a very brilliant story. And ultimately finding true north in the star in both of these directions. Because it is going to be an acknowledgement of our triggers, but it is going to be an acknowledgement of all of our grand ideas of self as well. So, party on. That's a really solid place to be. I'm really loving this deck. They're working very well together. How exhilarating. But party on. With that being said, always take time to breathe when things are really frustrating. And there was an extreme decompression I felt in my shoulders at one point, trying to feel everything. I think it was the second time we breathed together, and I feel like that is something that we'll need to keep on, hold on to the idea too, where everything's got us like this. How can we find a little bit of ease, and how can we sort of contradict the tension? How can we be preventative to injury from the tension? And I mean, in a very metaphorical, mental and spiritual injury, but also very literal and physical too. You'd be surprised how just something as simple as breathing can help you find balance again in really difficult times. And sometimes we still fall to our impulse, but understanding where that comes from, why that's triggering, and how it exists on a spiritual plane for you is also really important in bringing yourself back to that breath in those moments, in those Tens of Swords moments, in those Eight of Wands moments. And ultimately, I think that is the key to grounding, and is the key to reorganizing when our energies get chaotic. It's almost like if your earth and your air and everything drifts from you, then you can kind of pull it back to center. If you feel it drifting, then pull it back to center. And sometimes that's done in multiple ways, but breath is a great first step. So, party on. I'm rambling. Happy full moon. And keep kicking ass, and be kind to yourself. I mean, kicking ass spiritually. Be kind to yourself. Don't start fights, just finish them. But yes, party on. Love ya.